Hello everyone! Today we're going to talk about the story Secret War, and at the end of the video we're going to get into some of my thoughts about the writer Brian Michael Bendis as a whole. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more comic book related content. Now if you haven't checked it out, we did a whole recap of the story you can watch with this handy playlist that you can check out here if you're interested. This video is a review of the comic itself and my thoughts on the storyline, which was published over 2004 and 2005. The date of publication in the case of this comic is very important and relevant in understanding Secret War. It is a direct political thesis of its time, with clear references to a number of events in American history, both recent stuff of that time period and from long before. First and foremost are the most obvious political influences, the one the comic wears on its sleeve, 9/11. But also, this story was very clearly about American foreign policy going back all the way to post-World War II. Nick Fury, especially this iteration of the character at the time, is absolutely a physical embodiment of that, most of all. And I couldn't be more literal in saying that sort of thing about this particular character, who as a character has been around the entire time since World War II, committing some variation of CIA-style spy work on behalf of the American government. That's Nick Fury's story. He has literally stood in for everything the government has done abroad, good or bad, on behalf of the United States. Has been doing this sort of thing this whole time. And that's been used adequately to explore politics through this character for a long period, and it all sort of comes to a head here in Secret War, where writer Brian Michael Bendis does a good job of exploring the ins and outs of American politics of that era, and the overall history of the United States in terms of its relationship with the rest of the world. Critics might not like how even-handed the whole thing is, but I think Secret War does a great job at having a strong statement without being blunt or broad about it. There's clearly an angle here. Nick Fury's actions during his Secret War is definitely viewed as a bad thing. A lot of people die, and he absolutely used the superheroes in a very gross way, which the story clearly identifies by brutally killing a fake version of the character. Wolverine is the one who at least attempts to exact justice over this, but I think the violation of the character that happens the most is to Spider-Man. And that's not a criticism of Bendis, it's an observation of how messed up Fury's actions during all of this are. Fury completely used Peter Parker and manipulated him into being compliant in atrocities that go very much against the philosophy of this character. And as a result of all of this, half the country is nearly wiped out were it not for the timely intervention of one particular superhero, so it really just comes down to luck. So the comic clearly is identifying Nick Fury as bad, but don't get me wrong, it does a great job, especially in the first couple of issues, in showing you exactly what Nick Fury was doing and why. I don't necessarily agree with his specific actions, but I totally understand his reasoning. They do a great job in subtly showing and implying how Liberia was probably messing around with America using these supervillains for a very long time. And it suddenly becomes a lot more understandable how a bunch of random dudes that don't seem all that smart to begin with are able to supposedly create this military-grade experimental weaponry. It's a brilliant comic on several levels in that regard. At the start of my recap video for Secret War, I said this particular story holds a special place in my heart in the world of the Marvel Secret Warses out there, and their variations, because only Secret War has anything resembling this sort of dense political commentary. Given that the 1984 Secret Wars was a wild sci-fi fantasy hybrid freak show, and Secret Wars 2 is some sort of borderline surreal exploration of human behavior, the choice to make Secret War an entirely different and completely unrelated story was pretty strong. I would even call it brave, given how comic book fans can be, and how controversial some of the politics are in this book. But everything in here works really well, and I think it speaks to how quality can mitigate a lot. Bendis doesn't get hammy about the politics of all of this, but the comic is inherently and entirely political. It's well made and carefully thought through, not just in terms of politics, but also in structure. I think it's cool and, again, pretty brave to not really show us the Secret War. We get snippets of it, always in flashback, but are otherwise forced to imagine how the rest of it plays out. Instead, the main focus of the series is on the fallout of the war, a raw, emotional reaction to an event that happened a while ago, the full details of which we aren't and should never really be privy to. Even the choice of who was sent out on this particular mission is well thought out by the writers and thoroughly explained, at least in the graphic novel, which is full of Nick Fury's notes on each character chosen, but also characters Fury didn't pick, and explanations as to why. Speaking of which, that graphic novel is a great example of a quality republication of an existing comic book series. Where ordinary series might just throw in a few alternate covers into the graphic novel, Secret War features pages and pages of files from Nick Fury's own S.H.I.E.L.D. database, which provide a ton of insight and add a lot to the story. Secret War is limited in that we don't get a lot of work on the characters themselves. Everyone barely has time to flinch at all the trauma unfolding around them before the next part of the story has to happen. That's okay though, because Marvel actually did follow up on this story in the future. Looking back on it in terms of continuity, this is a pretty essential Marvel story. We get introduced to Maria Hill leading S.H.I.E.L.D., which directly ties into Civil War and the shape of the Marvel Universe over the next decade in these comics. Nick Fury is ousted from power, and this iteration would pretty much never return to that role, destined to become a Watcher and all the crazy stuff from Original Sin. This comic does a great job at introducing us to then new hero Daisy Johnson, also known as Quake. So the limitation of character development, in my opinion, isn't a real limitation. It's set up, but was very much followed up on in later stories. Many of the characters involved in Secret War were also affected by this, and as characters began distancing themselves and mistrusting S.H.I.E.L.D. more and more, which would provide fuel and an important underlying character motivation in Civil War and beyond. But the other reason that we have to kind of limit character development in this story is because this comic was always going to require a relatively limited run. And that's because it was necessary in order to feature the paintings by Gabriele Dell'Otto. This Italian artist was new to Marvel, I believe at the time, and he really knocked it out of the park with high quality painted comics like this. The only trade-off of them really being that they must have taken an enormous amount of time and work. So it makes sense that artwork like this just can't be consistently used in a longer comic. I'm not sure if there's any real example of that in comic book history. This is very much a trade-off of quality over quantity. Some of the editors and creators behind Secret War talk a lot about how much Gab, as they refer to him, brought this series to life, and it shows. I can see that myself. Everything on the page just springs into action as it ramps up, and it feels so intense and instantly out of control. But the art's not so chaotic you can't tell what's going on, with only a couple of small exceptions. I imagine some don't like the more realistic design on characters such as the Thing, but it really gives the story a cinematic feel to it that I think the story really needed and benefits from. Dell'Otto's artwork is critical in making the story feel distinct and memorable, and coming back to it, Secret War on the whole holds up remarkably well. I would say it was one of the more important Marvel events in recent history, but also one of the better ones too, even when compared to some of the crazy stuff we've been getting out of the company over the last year. I'm surprised at how much I enjoyed coming back to this comic, since it was one of the first ones I ever read, and I wasn't sure how much that opinion would hold up given that it's been almost 15 years. It's very impressive how much of this comic still works. The politics very much feel of that era, but who are we kidding, still very much relevant today too. Perhaps what is most amazing about all of this is the fact that this comic was written by Brian Michael Bendis himself. If this was your first ever comic read by him, like it was for me, you might get the wrong impression of the writer. I quickly learned that's not the case with Bendis because he's written a lot of comics, and Secret War really stands out of place with most of them. He does do some things like Jessica Jones and the Old Man Logan's Secret Wars tie-in that show he has this range and is quite capable of writing stories like this. But Secret War remains one of his better works and still feel unusual given Brian Michael Bendis' usual sensibilities as a writer. It's something I want to explore about him as a writer in the future because it's very interesting and a unique quality that seems to only really reflect Bendis and a handful of others. Overall, I absolutely recommend you check out Secret War for yourself. It's a really fun and interesting read, well done in a number of key ways that I hope I've successfully highlighted here for you guys. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at a DC comic that has a very interesting take on the whole alternate universe shtick, which I learned about last year. So stay tuned for JLA The Nail, and thanks for watching this video.